Hi everyone, and welcome back for part 2 of chapter 1 of Ella Montgomery's Magic for Marigold. What's in a Name? Part 3. The baby had to be talked all over again, and Uncle William over the bay covered himself with indelible disgrace by saying dubiously, "She is not, really a pretty child, do you think?" "All the better for her future looks," said old grandmother tartly. She had been biding her time like a watchful cat to give a timely dig. "You," she added maliciously, "were a very pretty baby, though you did not have any more hair on your head then, you have now. Beauty is a fatal gift. She will be better without it," sighed Aunt Nina. "Then why do you cold cream your face every night and eat raw carrots for your complexion and dye your hair?" asked old grandmother. Aunt Nina couldn't imagine how old grandmother knew about the carrots. She had no cat to tattle to Lucifer. "We are all as God made us," said Uncle Ebenezer piously. "Then God botched some of us," snapped old grandmother, looking significantly at Uncle Ebenezer's enormous ears and the frill of white whisker around his throat that made him look oddly like a sheep. But then, reflected old grandmother, whoever might be responsible for the nose, it was hardly fair to blame God for Ebenezer's whiskers. "She has a peculiarly shaped hand, hasn't she?" persisted Uncle William over the bay. Aunt Anne bent over and kissed one of the little hands. "The hand of an artist," she said. Lorraine looked at her gratefully and hated Uncle William over the bay bitterly for 10 minutes under her golden hair. "Handsome is as handsome does," said Uncle Archibald, who rarely opened his mouth save to emit a proverb. "Would you mind telling me, Archibald," said old grandmother pleasantly, "if you really look that solemn when you're asleep?" No one answered her. Aunt Mary Martha over the bay, the only one who could have answered, had been dead for 10 years. "Whether she's pretty or not, she's going to have very long lashes," said Aunt Anne, reverting to the baby as a safer subject of conversation. There was no sense in letting old grandmother start a family row for her own amusement so soon after poor Leander's passing away. "God help the men, then," said Uncle Quan gravely. Aunt Anne wondered why old grandmother was laughing to herself until the bed shook. Aunt Anne reflected that it would have been just as well if Klondike, with his untimely sense of humor, had not been present in a serious assemblage like this. "Well, we must give her a pretty name, anyhow," said Aunt Flora briskly. "It's simply a shame that it's been left as long as this. No Leslie ever was before. Come, grandmother, you ought to name her. What do you suggest?" Old grandmother affected the indifferent. She had 3 namesakes already, so she knew Leander's baby wouldn't be called after her. "Call it what you like," she said. "I'm too old to bother about it. Fight it out among yourselves." "But we'd like your advice, grandmother." "Unfortunately," said Aunt Leah, whom old grandmother was just detesting because she had noticed the minute Leah shook hands with her that she had had her nails manicured. "I have no advice to give. I have nothing but a little wisdom, and I cannot give you that. Neither can I help it if a woman has a bargain counter nose." "Are you referring to my nose?" inquired Aunt Leah with spirit. She often said she was the only one in the clan who wasn't afraid of old grandmother. "The pig that's bit squeals," retorted old grandmother. She leaned back on her pillows disdainfully and sipped her tea with a vengeance. She had got square with Leah for manicuring her nails. She had insisted on having her dinner first so that she might watch the others eating theirs. She knew it made them all more or less uncomfortable. Oh, but it was fine to be able to be disagreeable again. She had had to be so good and considerate for 4 months. 4 months was long enough to mourn for anybody. 4 months of not daring to give anybody a wigging. They had seemed like 4 centuries. Lorraine sighed. She knew what she wanted to call her baby. but she knew that she would never have the courage to say it. And if she did, she knew that they would never consent to it. When you married into a family like the Leslies, you had to take the consequences. It was very hard when you couldn't name your own baby, when you were not even asked what you'd like it named. If Lee had only lived, it would have been different. Lee, who was not a bit like the other Leslies, except Uncle Quan a little. Lee, who loved wonder and beauty and laughter that had been hushed so suddenly. Surely the jests of heaven must have had more spice since he had joined in them. How he would have howled at this august conclave over the naming of his baby. How he would have brushed them aside. Lorraine felt sure he would have let her call her baby. "I think," said Mrs. David Leslie, throwing her bombshell gravely and sadly, "that it would only be graceful and fitting that she should be called after Leander's first wife." Mrs. David and Clementine had been very intimate friends, but Clementine? Lorraine shivered again and wished she hadn't, for Aunt Anne's eye looked like another shawl. Everybody looked at Clementine's picture. "Poor little Clementine," sighed Aunt Stacia in a tone that made Lorraine feel she should never have taken poor little Clementine's place. "Do you remember what lovely jet-black hair she had?" asked Aunt Marcia. "And what lovely hands," said Great-Aunt Matilda. "She was so young to die," sighed Aunt Josephine. "She was such a sweet girl," said Great-Aunt Elizabeth. "A sweet girl, all right," agreed Uncle Quan. "But why condemn an innocent child to carry a name like that all her life? That would really be a sin." The clan, with the exception of Mrs. David, felt grateful to him and looked it, especially young grandmother. The name simply wouldn't have done, no matter how sweet Clementine was. That horrid old song, for instance, "Oh, my darling Clementine," the boys used to howl along the roads at night. No, not for a Leslie. But Mrs. David was furious, not only because Klondike disagreed with her, but because he was imitating her old lisp, so long outgrown that it really was mean of him to drag it up like this. "Will you have some more dressing?" inquired young grandmother graciously. "No, thank you." Mrs. David was not going to have any more, by way of signifying displeasure. Later on, she took a still more terrible revenge by leaving 2/3 of her pudding uneaten, knowing that young grandmother had concocted it. Young grandmother woke up in the night and wondered if anything could really have been the matter with the pudding. The others might have eaten it out of politeness. "If Leander's name had been almost anything else, she might have been named for her father," said Great-Uncle Walter. "Roberta, Georgina, Johanna, Andrea, Stephanie, Wilhelmina, or Davidina," said Uncle Quan, but Great-Uncle Walter ignored him. "You can't make anything out of a name like Leander. Whatever did you call him that for, Marion?" "His grandfather named him after him who swam the Hellespont," said young grandmother, as rebukingly as if she had not, 35 years before, cried all one night because old grandfather had given her baby such a horrid name. "She might be called Hero," said Uncle Quan. "We had a dog called that once," said old grandmother. "Leander didn't tell you before he died that he wanted any special name, did he, Lorraine?" inquired Lena. "No," faltered Lorraine. He had so little time to tell me anything." The clan frowned at Nina as a unit. They thought she was very tactless. But what could you expect of a woman who wrote poetry and peddled it about the country? Writing it might have been condoned and concealed. After all, the Leslies were not intolerant, and everybody had some shortcomings. But selling it openly? "I should like baby to be called Gabriella," persisted Nina. "There has never been such a name among the Leslies," said old grandmother, and that was that. I think it's time we had some new names, said the poetess rebelliously. But everyone looked stony, and Nina began to cry. She cried upon the slightest provocation. Lorraine remembered that Leander had always called her Mrs. Gummidge. Come, come, said old grandmother. Surely we can name this baby as well comfortably as uncomfortably. Don't make the mistake, Nina, of thinking that you are helping things along by making a martyr of yourself. What do you think, Miss Silversides? Inquired Uncle Charlie, who thought Salome was being entirely ignored and didn't like it. Oh, it doesn't matter what I think. I am of no consequence, said Salome, ostentatiously helping herself to the pickles. Come, come now, you're one of the family, coaxed Uncle Charlie, who knew, so he said, how to handle women. Well, Salome relaxed because she was really dying to have her say in it. I've always thought that names that ended in I-N-E were so elegant. My choice would be Rosalind. Or Evangeline, said Great Uncle Walter. Or Eglinton, said Aunt Marcia eagerly. Or Gelatin, said Uncle Quan. There was a pause. Juno would be such a nice name, said Cousin Teresa. But we are Presbyterians, said old grandmother. Or Robinette, suggested Uncle Charlie. We are English, said young grandmother. I think Yvonne is such a romantic name, said Aunt Flora. Names have really nothing to do with romance, said Uncle Quan. The most thrilling and tragic love affair I ever knew was between a man named Silas Twinkletoe and a woman named Kezia Birtwhistle. It's my opinion children shouldn't be named at all. They should be numbered until they're grown up, then choose their own names. But then you are not a mother, my dear Horace, said young grandmother tolerantly. Besides, there's an Yvonne Clubine keeping a lingerie shop in Charlottetown, said Aunt Josephine. Lingerie? If you mean underclothes, for heaven's sake, say so, snapped old grandmother. Juanita is rather a nice uncommon name, suggested John Eddie Leslie over the bay. Juanita. Nobody would know how to spell it or pronounce it, said Aunt Marcia. I think, began Uncle Quan, but Aunt Josephine took the road. I think, Place aux Dames, murmured Uncle Quan. Aunt Josephine thought he was swearing, but ignored him. I think the baby should be called after one of our missionaries. It's a shame that we have 3 foreign missionaries in the connection, and not one of them has a namesake, even if they are only 4th cousins. I suggest we call her Harriet, after the oldest one. But, said Aunt Anne, that would be slighting Ellen and Louise. Well, said young grandmother haughtily. Young grandmother was haughty because nobody had suggested naming the baby after her. Call her the whole 3 names, Harriet, Ellen, Louise, Leslie. Then no 4th cousin need feel slighted. The suggestion seemed to find favor. Lorraine caught her breath anxiously and looked at Uncle Quan, but rescue came from another quarter. Have you ever, said old grandmother with a wicked chuckle, thought what the initials spell? They hadn't. They did. Nothing more was said about missionaries. Part 4. Sylvia is a beautiful name, ventured Uncle Howard, whose first sweetheart had been a Sylvia. You couldn't call her that, said Aunt Millicent in a shocked tone. Don't you remember great Uncle Marshall Sylvia went insane? She died filling the air with shrieks. I think Bertha would be more suitable. Why, there's a Bertha in John C. Leslie's family over the bay, said young grandmother. John C. was a distant relative who was at outs with his clan, so Bertha would never do. Wouldn't it be nice to name her Adela? Said Aunt Anne. You know Adela is the only really distinguished person the connection has ever produced. A famous authoress. I should like the mystery of her husband's death to be cleared up before any grandchild of mine is called after her," said young grandmother austerely. "Nonsense, mother, you surely don't suspect Adela?" "There was arsenic in the porridge," said young grandmother darkly. "I'll tell you what the child should be called," said Aunt Sibylla, who had been waiting for the psychic moment. "Theodora! It was revealed to me in a vision of the night. I was awakened by a feeling of icy coldness on my face. I came all out in gooseflesh, and I heard a voice distinctly pronounce the name, Theodora. I wrote it down in my diary as soon as I arose." John Eddie Leslie over the bay laughed. Sibylla hated him for weeks for it. "I wish," said sweet old great-aunt Matilda, "that she could be called after my little girl who died." Aunt Matilda's voice trembled. Her little girl had been dead for 50 years, but she was still unforgotten. Lorraine loved Aunt Matilda. She wanted to please her, but she couldn't call her dear baby Emmelinza. "It's unlucky to call a child after a dead person," said Aunt Anne positively. "Why not call the baby Jane?" said Uncle Peter briskly. "My mother's name. A good, plain, sensible name that'll wear. Nickname it to suit any age. Jenny, Janie, Janet, Jeanette, Jean, and Jane for the 70s. "Oh, wait till I'm dead, please," wailed old grandmother. "It would always make me think of Jane Putcamer." Nobody knew who Jane Putcamer was, or why old grandmother didn't want to think of her. As nobody asked why, the dessert having just been begun, old grandmother told them. "When my husband died, she sent me a letter of condolence written in red ink. Jane indeed." So the baby escaped being Jane. Lorraine felt really grateful to old grandmother. She had been afraid Jane might carry the day, and how fortunate there was such a thing as red ink in the world. "Funny about nicknames," said Uncle Clon. "I wonder, did they have nicknames in biblical times? Was Jonathan ever shortened into Joe? Was King David ever called Dave? And fancy Melchizedek's mother always calling him that." "Melchizedek hadn't a mother," said Mrs. David triumphantly, and forgave Uncle Clon. But not young grandmother. The pudding remained uneaten. "20 years ago, Jonathan Leslie gave me a book on the hereafter," said old grandmother reminiscently. "And he's been in the hereafter 18 years, and I am still in the here." "Anyone would think you expected to live forever," said Uncle Jarvis, speaking for the first time. He had been sitting in silence, hoping gloomily that Leander's baby was an elect infant. What mattered a name compared to that? "I do," said old grandmother, chuckling. That was one for Jarvis, the solemn old ass. "We're not really getting anywhere about the baby's name, you know," said Uncle Paul desperately. "Why not let Lorraine name her own baby?" said Uncle Clon suddenly. "Have you any name you'd like her called, dear?" Again Lorraine caught her breath. Oh, hadn't she? She wanted to call her baby Marigold. In her girlhood, she had had a dear friend named Marigold, the only girlfriend she ever had. Such a dear, wonderful, bewitching, lovable creature. She had filled Lorraine's starved childhood with beauty and mystery and affection. And she had died. If only she might call her baby Marigold. But she knew the horror of the clan over such a silly, fanciful, outlandish name. Old grandmother, young grandmother, no, they would never consent. She knew it. All her courage exhaled from her in a sigh of surrender. "No," she said in a small, hopeless voice. Oh, if she were only not such a miserable coward. And that terrible old grandmother knew it. "She's fibbing," she thought. "She has a name, but she's too scared to tell it. Clementine, now, she would have stood on her own feet and told them what was what. Old grandmother looked at Clementine, forever gazing at her lily, and forgot that the said Clementine's ability to stand on her own feet and tell people, even old grandmother, what was what, had not especially commended her to old grandmother at one time. But old grandmother liked people with a mind of their own when they were dead. Old grandmother was beginning to feel bored with the whole matter. What a fuss over a name! As if it really mattered what that mite in the cradle with the golden fuzz on her head was called. Old grandmother looked at the tiny, sleeping face curiously. Lorraine's hair, but Leander's chin and brow and nose. A fatherless baby with only that foolish Winthrop girl for a mother. I must live long enough for her to remember me, thought old grandmother. It's only a question of keeping on at it. Marion has no imagination and Lorraine has too much. Somebody must give that child a few hints to live by, whether she's to be Minx or Madonna. If it was only a boy, it would be so easy to name it, said Uncle Paul. Then for 10 minutes they wrangled over what they would have called it if it had been a boy. They were beginning to get quite warm over it when Aunt Myra took a throbbing in the back of her neck. "I'm afraid one of my terrible headaches is coming on," she said faintly. "What would women do if headaches had never been invented?" asked old grandmother. "It's the most convenient disease in the world. It can come on so suddenly, go so conveniently, and nobody can prove we haven't got it." "I'm sure no one has ever suffered as I do," sighed Myra. "We all think that," said old grandmother, seeing a chance to shoot another poisoned arrow. "I'll tell you what's the matter with you. Eye strain. You should really wear glasses at your age, Myra." "Why can't those headaches be cured?" said Uncle Paul. "Why don't you try a new doctor?" "Who is there to try now that poor Leander is in his grave?" wailed Myra. "I don't know what we Leslies are ever going to do without him. We'll just have to die. Dr. Moore drinks and Dr. Stackley is an evolutionist. And you wouldn't have me go to that woman doctor, would you?" "No, of course not. No Leslie would go to that woman doctor." Dr. M. Woodruff Richards had been practicing in Harmony for 2 years, but no Leslie would have called in a woman doctor if he had been dying. One might as well commit suicide. Besides, a woman doctor was an outrageous portent, not to be tolerated or recognized at all. As Uncle Robert said indignantly, "The women are getting entirely too intelligent." Klondike Leslie was especially sarcastic about her. An unsexed creature, he called her. Klondike had no use for unfeminine women who aped men. Neither fish nor flesh nor good red herring, as young grandfather had been wont to say. But they talked of her through their coffee and did not again revert to the subject of the baby's name. They were all feeling a trifle sore over that. It seemed to them all that neither old grandmother nor young grandmother nor Lorraine had backed them up properly, with the result that all the guests went home with the great question yet unsettled. "Just as I expected. All squawks. Nothing but squawks as usual," said old grandmother. "We might have known what would happen when we had this on Friday," said Salome as she washed up the dishes. "Well, the great affair is over," said Lucifer to the Witch of Endor as they discussed a plate of chicken bones and pope's noses on the back veranda. "And that baby hasn't got a name yet. But these celebrations are red-letter days for us. Listen to me purr." That ends Chapter 1 of Magic for Marigold. Thanks very much for listening. This is Andrea, signing off.